I'm going to run and go get the copies. I thought Pam had printed out every single one. It only printed out certain ones. You can have a space at the table so you can choose whatever you like. Hi. So there's always room at the table.
I know.
And here you have there's a packet for you of handout stuff, and then we'll have the PowerPoint up to. It's just so you're not left out of the rest of the conversation. And then I printed special for you, just the slide up close of the current policy. When they get out, didn't know.
Am I speaking to all of this?
No, I'm not talking to you. I'm gonna talk to you. We'll talk together and hopefully we'll have a conversation.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, but I wanted you to have.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I said we all have pieces to add, discuss.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I just wanted you to have everything that everybody else has.
Perfect.
Unless they're having issues, leave them plugged in for now, I would say, and we should be okay.
Just trying to make sure
Oh, yeah,
everybody
we should
had some
get-
power.
Yeah, we should get it up, so we have an agenda.
Just wanted to make
Oh.
sure. Oh, you're at 90,
Yeah, I
so.
think we're all plugged in.
Do you want to be plugged in, or do you want me to unplug?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Leave it like this?
Yes, that's fine. Oh, you were trying to charge, is it?
Well, I was trying to charge more. Let's see where Karen's at. Oops, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
You're at 98. Hey, close enough, huh?
Yeah.
So we're on live stream, just so everybody knows. Alexis coming.
Yes.
Are you feeling better? I am, thank you. Took a little while, to start.
The rest of us toughed it out, right? You're the smart one.
So you're gonna laugh because this is further proof that I cannot work a copier today. So the first time I went and tried to print out handouts, some of you will see that some of yours have 3 holes punched on the sides. I don't know why. And then I don't know who's the lucky recipient of those. There's nothing different about them, just print out on that paper. And then now I went to print something else out with notes, and then for whatever reason, it's an 8x10 document, but it printed out. So the answer, I don't know.
That's okay. Karen had to come to my rescue because I almost broke it earlier.
You almost did what?
You're
Broke
okay.
it.
I'm
Getting jammed.
no, I'm not.
So apparently, then you all did this. I didn't do this.
We're good, we're good.
Okay.
Up to us.
He should be good.
When I grabbed off the printer, I told him I was a 3-minute warning, so he should be coming around the corner. It's like, we're ready. Okay, it's
How do I
picking
do
up.
this? For Debbie.
Oh, just call her.
Just call
Call
her?
her now.
Call her now. Call her now. Call you,
Is it
Debbie.
okay if I pull up the presentation,
No.
Karen?
Yes.
Okay.
I have Denise on the phone already.
This is you.
All right. A minute.
Hi, Deb.
Pay no attention.
We're just getting stuff set up here. Oh,
Ready?
Karen's on the floor messing with a bunch of wires.
We can call to order, right? All right. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call our work session meeting to order. And I'd like to welcome all of you. This is a session on policy review and our Open Public Meetings Act review. And I'd like to call Dr. Watts to begin the work session, please.
Thank you, President Mengadassalam, members of the board, staff, and community members. At this time, I will.
Apologize.
Okay.
I would like to state that Director Daniels is on the phone. She's not feeling well tonight, so she will be absent. And Director Strauss is on her way. She's also on the phone currently, and she'll be here around 6:30. Thank you.
So Karen,
Oh,
I can't hear my,
And Director.
Okay, hang on.
Director Hardy is excused from tonight's board meeting.
Should I put it up
Work
closer to
session.
you?
Is the volume
Yeah, volume's up.
on? Okay. Oh, but what
She's
about
on,
there?
oh, right there?
Yeah,
Does that work?
that should work. Yeah,
Can she hear you that way, though?
We can do it best.
there we go.
We're putting you next to the little green light, Debbie.
okay.
At this time, I will ask Dr. Jewel Harmon, Chief Accountability Officer, to begin our presentation on November 2018 our policy work session regarding most recently updated policies. Dr. Harmon?
So, thank you and good evening. I appreciate our last regular board meeting and my colleagues for taking great notes. And we're going to discuss some of those policies that were on the October 24th board meeting for an additional reading to make sure that there are additional changes are corrected before they go for approval at the next regular meeting, hopefully. So just a reminder of our guiding policy for review process. It's policy 1310. We don't need to cover it. We're becoming more familiar with that as we go through. And I would encourage you, if you'd like to follow along, to follow the board agenda because all of the policies are there, so you don't have to worry about the presentation if you just want to open up the notes. So we're going to start right away with 6210. And what you see before you is a document that doesn't have any changes from last regular meeting because there were some questions about the definitions, capital outlay, and where some of those things came from that I wanted to clarify. And in order for us to discuss that, it has to be on the agenda. So that's why it's here, to make sure we've captured the appropriate changes. And so in the October 24th board meeting, there was a discussion around whether or not 5,000 or 50,000 was the correct amount and what pieces were missing or what amounts were spent in terms of capital outlay. And so the capital outlay definition that is outlined in the policy 6210 as proposed, actually comes from the link to the Federal Register. So 2 CFR, the last legal reference at the top, is where this definition comes from. It is the formal legal definition for capital outlay. It was included because in our prior work session, that was one of the requests, but it doesn't have to be present if it's not of district or board interest. The other decision point that was discussed was whether the $5,000 amount was too small, 50,000 was too large. And there was a request for data and information around how many purchases were made, how much dollars were spent, district dollars were spent on capital outlay. Because of the very restrictive nature of the capital outlay definition, there are not a lot of expenditures last school year 17-18 on capital outlay. The documentation that you were handed at last board meeting actually covered all of the capital outlay expenditures for the 17-18 school year, and there were about 7. The majority of them were under $10,000. So for example, Kentwood Pack got a projector that was $9,500. There was a Kyocera printer at Northwood that was $6,000. The ticket booth at Kent Lake got some reworkings done that was approximately $5,000. And so they are all clearly under the $50,000 mark. So there's good evidence to say that 50,000 is probably too high because you wouldn't see any of those capital outlay amounts. And although it seems like 5,000 would be particularly burdensome, it isn't given the number of purchases made. So you still would have seen those large purchases. To give you an example of what you might have missed, if you set it at 5,000, would be, the only one that you would have missed would have been some updates to our ARC mail system, and that was $2,300. All of the others were over the $5,000 mark, so you would have seen those for board approval or discussion. So it appears that based on the data of 1718, that 5,000 might actually be an appropriate amount to keep you all informed and involved in the spending process for capital outlay. Now that solves one problem. That does not solve the larger problem that's been at the heart of the discussion, which is the gap that exists between the capital outlay policy and a larger policy about procurement and purchasing in general. And so what I propose that you'll see is what's actually a new policy, which is 6211. So I'd like you to indulge me and let's look at 6211 as a possibility and a policy. And so this is not a WASDA model policy. It does not exist in WASDA. It was actually modeled after Seattle. And what Seattle did, I think, was smart to the extent that they recognize that there's a gap too in policy. And so they've tried to create this procurement piece that addresses the spending of the district and sets a dollar amount for all expenditures. So what the proposed policy does is it lays out $25,000 as the value of where the board would seek to see all purchases. And that excludes sales tax, but outside of sales tax, $25,000 is the amount, and it's all purchases, regardless of the source of funding. So grant funding, MOU, any of those pieces. So regardless of the source of where the funding comes from, if it is a district purchase and it is over $25,000, it would come to the board. So my proposal is that we take a first read of this and then consider making adjustments to this procurement policy to round out our purchasing section in our 6200 series.
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, so going back to 6210, there's only one legal reference, right, which is the CFR 200.439?
Yes.
And so when you look at that particular legal reference, it goes on to define capital assets. I don't see anywhere where it defines capital outlay, but it defines capital assets and capital expenditures. And that definition is very different from what's here. So my first question is, where did that definition, capital outlay, come from? Because it's not coming from the legal reference that's here.
So the definition is there. The examples of capital outlay expenditures come from OSPI. So we have a chart of accounts manual through OSPI of what we're allowed to spend capital outlay dollars on, and the examples of that come from there.
Yeah, so I meant the explanation of, or the definition of capital outlay. It says equipment and improvements to buildings or ground structure, infrastructure. But the federal policy actually says, here's what it says: capital expenditures means expenditures to acquire capital assets, which are defined as land, buildings, equipment, intellectual property, including software, or expenditures to make additions, improvements. So that's very different from just being equipment. It's also including intellectual property, intangible and tangible property, including software. So my concern is that we are defining capital outlay unnecessarily if we are referencing the CFR, which includes, capital expenditures includes assets that are all encompassing, from what I see.
So they're not
If they have a useful life of years.
So they're not exactly all encompassing. So all purchases are not capital outlay.
No. I mean,
Okay,
if they
that's-
have certain, if they're over useful years of, if they're depreciated or is not expensed. So software purchases would be one of those if it's over $25,000. So I don't see, full explanation of what it means.
So would you like an expanded definition of capital outlay and expenditures? Is that the request?
Well, I'd like to make sure if we're referencing the federal regulation that particular, we use the exact definition of that legal
Okay.
reference, which is, I can give you
And
this
this,
copy
the
of that.
definition of expenditures versus assets, you're saying?
Well, capital
includes-
assets and capital expenditures, yeah. The capital expenditures include capital assets, which is defined as including intellectual property, software. So that's why I felt like we were kind of deviating from the model policy.
So we have deviated quite a bit from the model.
Yeah.
And so the model policy provides no definitions, and so the initial version at the I believe, first reading was an exact proposal of the WASDA model policy. And at that time, the conversation was around adding some clarifying definitions, and so that's where this came from. And so I guess what I need some clarity on is, are we moving back to the model policy with no definitions, or are we going to move further into what we just discussed, which is clearing up and clarifying and giving that exact definition?
Well, I brought this up twice, at the last meeting and the meeting before, that we're not looking at the CFR definition, which includes, you know, very specifically software. And so I just want to make sure we're following if we're referencing a CFR, then we should follow their definition.
So I apologize. I must have overlooked that in the transcription notes because I didn't have that in the.
Yeah, I've
They were-
brought it up twice
Okay.
now. But regardless, you know, I think we just need to make sure that staff or whoever is responsible understands. Maybe that would be in the procedures, because we didn't have a procedure, right? But WASDA does have a procedure
So
for that policy.
Yes, and so until we were clear on what our parameters were, because when we first started this conversation around capital outlay in 6210, we weren't sure what our dollar amounts were, how liberal or broad or narrow the definition of capital outlay was. And so it's difficult to develop procedures when that's iterative.
Yeah.
While you're having an ongoing iterative conversation about the actual policy. So if it looks like this is where we're headed and that's the missing piece, then now the procedures will be adopted based on this expanded definition and the language moving forward.
Yeah, so then the question is, why would we have even this if there's a $25,000 threshold? Because that would include, I would think, the 6211 or the new one.
So based on the definition of what capital outlay, capital expenditures are, there's still a gap of general purchases that aren't software, that are not related to improvements, boilers, furnaces. So what about programmatic purchases that deal with instruction? That's where that gap exists, is an example. It's a broad example, but that's an example, and that's why there's the procurement policy piece. Because that wouldn't necessarily fall under capital outlay and capital expenditures. Now, I'm okay with not adding an additional policy. I'm just trying to close the gap is why that proposal exists, so that there's no question about what expenses and purchases would go before the board.
I looked at the Seattle procedures. I mean, it's very detailed. There's several sections, 8 or 10 sections we're talking about. So it's hard to okay a policy without looking at the procedures that go along with it. So I know we're all working towards that, but I just want to say that, you know, I don't know if today we're saying this is okay or.
No, I'm not asking you to green light a policy. What I'm asking is to consider a first reading of closing a gap. So what I've said is, what I think is, there's a hole between 6210 and then moving into 6220, which moves into bids and the appropriate process when you reach a certain dollar amount. But there's a hole there for a different type of purchase. If the board doesn't feel that that exists, then there's no need for policy 6211. It was just, it looked like there was a policy hole there.
Are we saying this is broad enough, right, between, because there are two definitions that seem to be, they're not competing, but there are nuances between expenditures and outlay. So are we saying, or are we hearing then that we feel comfortable that this policy is broad enough for us then to work on a procedure that will be able to capture a typical expenditure within the threshold that we've suggested, whether it's $5,000 capital expenditure of 25,000 for 6211. So I'll go back to that broader question. Do we feel that the policy, as it's written in this first reading, is it broad enough to capture, I think, the definitions that you described?
Yeah, and I want to be clear, I'm not a lawyer. I don't have,
No,
I cannot.
we don't play one.
I don't play one, I'm not a lawyer. But I really think we need to have these audited or looked at, because I think this is very cumbersome, the way it's explained. And if we are defining capital outlay this way, then it doesn't make sense to me to even have it here. But if we're defining capital assets and capital expenditures per the Code of Federal Regulations, then that makes sense to me, because it is, we do have a lot of expenditures that fall under software that's not captured anywhere.
Absolutely, but what about those that aren't? And that's where 6211
Right.
comes in. And so that's why I want to make sure, what my goal in this is
Yeah.
to make sure that there's
No
no
gaps.
question
Yeah.
and there's no gap about what comes before the board.
Yeah.
And as we started to go down this path, it seemed that it was bigger than just a dollar amount. It then gets into the nuances of the types of then products, services that are purchased. Because what capital outlay doesn't cover are services.
Yeah.
So if we are engaging community partners, consultants, those kinds of things, they're not covered under any of these, and that's another example of a gap. So
But it
how-
is under 6220.
6220 speaks to when we take out a bid and when we open a contract, and how we have to bid and at what point. It doesn't really talk about at what point that has to come before the board. What it says is at what points we're legally required to have a formal bid. So we want to close those gaps, and we can talk more about it. That's why
Okay.
that's why all three are there, and they're kind of
What's
tied
most important.
together.
Okay.
So before we get into adding a third one into the mix of this conversation, what I can make a note to do is have a legal conversation about some of the nuances of this.
Yeah.
And then work with what might be the best course of action. Another alternative to this too would be to lean back to, as you suggested, possibly the WASDA model policy, which doesn't have any of the definitions or defining points. So that's just.
I like the Seattle version, but we have to have,
It is quite cumbersome.
all of those procedures in place if we're gonna do that. That's all I'm gonna say. But, yeah, because it's pretty defined very clearly.
So, I don't know if you can hear me. I like the idea of having a policy that fills part of the gap, because I think that there is a gap. I think what would be helpful to see is really kind of like a breakdown of here's an expense that would fall under this policy, and here's one that would fall under this policy, and here's one that would fall under this, just so that we get a better idea of what would actually go in each.
Thank you.
So the Seattle one does do that. They give examples under each, example under each section that they address under that, so, yeah. Would be helpful.
Create an example
But
for each one.
I just think it would be somewhat helpful, because I don't think everything will be captured by the capital one by any means.
Right.
Right, but people are agreeing.
Yeah.
I agree also.
So I made a note about providing the examples. I also made a note about expanding the definition, for providing examples under 6211 to clarify, and bringing forth the procedures as information to go along so you can see what that looks like. And then for 6210, expanding the definition of capital outlay and making that match the Federal Register, so that there's not any questions there either. So is that fair, a good capture of where we are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that takes us through 6210 and 6211. 6220, bless its heart, has not seen much change since its first reading. It continues to show up because it is the policy that is dependent upon what we do with 6210, meaning at what point we bring bids from vendors and contracts through the process. So what this walks through more than anything else is not so much the point at which it comes to the board, as in the legal requirements of when we have to take something to bid and put that out to multiple vendors to pursue the contract versus being able to say, we've identified a vendor as a single source and we'd like to bring it forward. So I've not made any changes to this. I'm not recommending changes as of yet because I'd like to see and make sure that all of gaps and holes are closed with our procurement and purchasing process before we make any changes and adopt anything, before the board adopts anything that has to do with our bids and contract processes and procedures. But it's included on the agenda because we cannot discuss it unless it is on the agenda.
So, Joel, there was one thing on there that I noticed, and I can't really see my note as I'm driving, but it had to do with bids being read in public when they're received. So I think I don't know if that's a legal requirement or it was just something that caught my eye in the policy. I know we're not talking in great detail tonight, but.
That is a fair thing to bring up, and I will ensure that I can address that and speak to it as to why it is included, meaning that is actually a legal requirement and something that we need to build into our procedure, or it is just language that WASDA has included as a positive practice or a good thing to do.
So, Dr. Harmon, you said that it didn't deviate from the policy model, WASDA policy, or did you say that? I'm sorry.
This one should be, even with our, so it does deviate a little bit because it starts with some Kent language. So the first paragraph is Kent. And then even the formatting starts to look like the WASDA model policy. So aside from the language that starts with the board recognizes the importance of, our language is a little bit different there. So I kept our belief systems around that piece. And then it starts with procurement, public works, and state funds. Aside from that, the reason why it's almost all orange is because it is almost an entirely direct copy and paste change from the WASDA model policy.
Okay, I'm looking at the changes. Okay.
So it is word for word, and then you can see to the side of that in the track changes version what we've deleted out of ours and why it's replaced with the WASDA model in orange.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And sorry. So right now it matches WASDA. Like I said, I don't have any recommended changes. That would be, right now it's the WASDA version. It would only change if there's some hole or gap based on what we do with 6210 or 11 in our procurement. But
what about the procedures that go along with that?
So right now, the procedures that we've included with it are those that match WASDA.
WASDA's.
And so we would update ours based on, if the recommendation from the board is to move forward with the WASDA version of the policy, then we would move forward with WASDA's version of the procedure.
Okay, perfect. Denise, Debbie, anybody else? Questions? Denise? Hello?
My laptop is dying. I had to get my charger.
Oh, sorry. Do you have any questions? No?
I don't. I'm not.
Okay.
All right. So based on the transcription notes that I have from the October 24th regular meeting, there was conversation around policy 6230 and the proposed changes around the dollar amount for gift acceptance, the $50, and where did that come from? And so that particular amount comes from RCW 42.52.150, limitations on gifts. And it actually calls out, this speaks to state officers, state employees. And by technical definition, we are state employees. So I figured that although this does not fall necessarily in the education section of the RCWs, it could apply to us. And so the dollar amount called there is $50. And so that is where that comes from, that $50 gift amount comes from. The rest of the language in terms of its deviation from WASDA model policy comes because of the clarifying definitions around relations with vendors. So WASDA's model does not get into clearly defining what a gift is, who a vendor is, if there are exceptions or exemptions to that. And so the exceptions and exemptions are also coming from that RCW. And it's on the screen as reference of where that comes from. And then
There's no definition of vendor, did you say?
so the definition of vendor actually comes from there as well. I'm sorry, that one, the definition of vendor comes from the United States Office of Government Ethics, and that's where that definition comes from, of who a vendor is. Because we wanted a clear definition of who could be defined as a vendor, and then what is a definition of a gift, and then what is an amount. And we didn't want to, or at least the board didn't seem that they wanted to necessarily delve into defining that themselves or going with a philosophical belief system. They wanted to lean on what was possibly a external governmental reference, and so that's why. But it is ours, and WASDA has no recommendation in that, so we're out there kind of on our own with it.
with it.
So I don't propose any changes from last week. I just wanted to clarify where it came from and why. So it's just kind of closing the loop there.
Yeah. Anybody have questions on the phone?
Nope, I think it's a good change.
So that's 6230. And so in the spirit of trying to round out all of the gaps, holes, and as we're cleaning up relationships with vendors and other things, that got us to 2 additional policies that are probably part of this group in a different way that deal with conflicts of interest. Interestingly enough, WASDA has it show up in 2 separate places. There's 6210, where it shows up for board and superintendent. And then there's 5251, which speaks to staff and employees. And so both of those are what show up next to kind of round out that whole piece. And this really came from, as I was looking at what WASDA was doing and how they, their model policy, I also looked at what other districts did and how they were talking about relationships with vendors and those pieces. And it always cross-referenced to those 2 policies. So that's what led me to these 2. 1610 has never existed in Kent before. So I'm proposing it as a first reading. It is not anything that is particularly different than what you would see in terms of the actions, and it aligns. I can see why it's a cross-reference with the relationship with vendors. This is completely WASDA model policy. It comes from no other district. It is straight WASDA. And this speaks to not just a little bit of relationships with vendors, it also speaks to other interest. So board or superintendent engaging in a district contract where they may have a personal vested financial interest because they either own stock or other pieces in the company. It speaks to hiring of family members, direct family members that are supervised. All of those things are covered here. So that is what this is, but it is mostly because it is a cross-reference in the WASDA model policy for relationships with vendors, and we didn't have it there. So that's why 6210 is on the docket today.
But,
1610, I'm
but
sorry.
why did it even come forward? I guess I'm, when I read through this, it almost seems like it's the primary issue there is employment of a spouse or for director or superintendent. And how did this even come about?
Because it's a cross-reference in the WASDA model policy for relationship with vendors is how it came about.
So
That's the
Potential
connection.
conflict of interest.
So it's a potential conflict of interest. So a relationship with vendor and accepting a gift is a potential conflict of interest. It's listed as a cross-reference. And so so part of the process of updating the policies is to update those that you all have identified, and then any cross-references that become part of it. And so 1610 is a cross-reference of conflict of interest. And we have it for staff, but we did not have a policy for board and superintendent. It's been on WASDA's model policy book since the late 1990s. And we've not ever had it on our books. So it's just a proposal of to round out our relationship with vendors, conflicts of interest, again, so there's no gaps, holes. We've got it clear. There's no questions for staff about relationship with vendors, conflicts of interest for any stakeholders of Kent School District. It's not something that has to be there. It's just in kind of closing the loop, it would be wise. The other reference, which would be next, is policy 5251, which is conflicts of interest for staff, which go into, conflicts of interest which go into the same kind of language, not just with vendors, but also with, it gets into, you'll see in a minute, I'm sorry.
I would add to that in a district this large, with this many employees, this is standard to have a policy like this in place because we have so many employment opportunities. A smaller district may not have as many openings,
But this one is speaking directly to board and superintendent, right?
That's correct.
And the next one speaks to the rest of the staff, so it's not just that, like,
No,
what
no, I follow.
right, what it does is it just closes the loop on any questions that anyone might have about why there is or isn't, so.
Consider the fact that we have literally hundreds, not thousands of relationships with potential vendors and products and services. Again, we've not talked about this, but it is also protection for us as an organization and an accountability measure.
So no action tonight is expected. It was just a first reading opportunity as we, like I said, in the spirit of kind of going through all of our procurement, purchasing, relationship with vendor pieces to clean all of that up kind of at one time. So that's 1610. 5251 is the next, and as I just stated, it is the last of the procurement relationship with vendor kind of series is what I'll call it. And it speaks to conflicts of interest with staff. The major change here that I'm proposing, we've had this on the books. This is not something that's new. The biggest change that I would absolutely recommend that the board take is that it is currently numbered in Kent as policy 5223. WASDA's model policy has it numbered as 5251. So if nothing else, I would recommend that we correct the policy number so that there's never any question about if WASDA decided to create a policy 5223, we wouldn't then have to correct or make changes. That's the biggest, most prominent change. And no KSD language was deleted, removed. It provides some clarity around staff tutoring of current students outside of the workday for compensation. That's the most recent WASDA update to that policy. It just clarifies. So for example, if I am, I guess the easiest example I can give is if I'm a music teacher and I want to give private music lessons to a student, I am fully allowed to do that and don't need board approval or my principal's approval to do so, as long as they are not currently my classroom student. And so the conflict of interest there would be I can't give a student a C or a D because they're not doing well and then offer my services for pay to help them improve. So that's the only change there, but that's why this one also ended up, it's also a cross-reference in the relationship with vendors.
So can we indicate that policy, I noticed we're just putting the 5223 to the side, that number. Can we indicate that this replaces?
Yes, and so I believe that in our policy manual, there's a track of notes of what happens to certain policy numbers, so we can do that.
So I do want to ask I'm curious now because going back to policy 6211, the new one.
Yes.
When I looked at Seattle's, theirs was labeled policy 6220.
Right, so they
they're
completely did their
switching.
own, right.
Yeah,
And
so they're not following
No, they're
any
not.
WASDA.
Right.
Okay.
And so that's an option that we could do as well, but I figured that just really complicates things and really moves us outside of something else.
Okay.
And so to
Okay.
make it clear and keep things clean, we keep our WASDA policies, WASDA recommended policies. And if we feel that there's a loophole, then we would address that on our own, or a gap, I'll say.
Okay.
That we address it through our additional own policy, at least until WASDA recognizes that and they clean it up. But we could also replace, I wouldn't recommend that, it makes it really confusing
Yeah.
to then update, because if the next person
Yeah,
comes
it's
along to do some updates and clean it up, it's like, oh, well, wait, we're not following it all. Well, there's a reason and a history why it's different. Well, no.
So what happens in board docs to the old one? What do we say on there? That this is no longer effective, or do we delete the entire?
So what we've not paid much attention to, and what people probably don't notice, that every single one of these that we've gone through has at the top the date it was adopted, last revised, and last reviewed. But at the bottom of every policy is
Yes.
every date
Right.
that it's been adopted, revised, or reviewed. So
Right.
that,
No, I've noticed that, but what I'm saying is, if
Previous
when we're,
versions?
yeah, so if we're no longer using that other policy number, what happens to it? Does it disappear out of board docs, or
so
do we
yes, the
put
policy,
down?
no, the policy number disappears, and it's now, you would find conflict of interest under 5251.
Okay,
So if someone on the public or the world were looking, they could still type in conflicts of interest in the search, and it would come up policy 5251 as the current policy.
okay, so that one disappears.
What we could do, I don't know if we've ever had to,
I have a
Let's talk about
concern on that.
what's your question?
Yeah.
I just want to tell you, what we end up doing though is, it would still be in, although it's a paper
archive,
archive,
right?
it's in archived.
But can public access that? No.
They can come in and look at the book, but it's
Oh.
not electronic. It's actually
So we have a
a
copy.
binder.
All right.
so
Okay. I kind of need to think about that, if that's okay, because I feel like if we're gonna get rid of, say, a 6220, or replace it with the 6211, and the 6210, and if that disappears from our site, I would want a record of what we followed in previous years versus current years. I don't know if that makes sense.
Looking at the dates, so I see where it says deleted May, I'm just curious about this, because it says deleted May 9th, 2007, and deleted May 9th, 2007 again. I'm wondering, was that incorrect, or what was that, because that date is not listed at the bottom? So what
Because-
was that date?
so that date was the last time it was revised and reviewed. So that date will then move to the back page as the previous last revised and reviewed date.
So you just haven't added it here?
Haven't added it because we haven't finished yet, so it's just sitting over there until we end. I'm sorry.
I think my question is different. It's the ones that are going to disappear. I don't know if we want it to disappear from complete view. Is there a way to keep it, but say inactive or something on board docs?
So-
At effective certain date.
So the policy isn't going to be inactive. There will still be an active conflicts of interest policy.
No.
It will
What
just
I'm
have a
saying
new
is-
number.
Right, but I'm talking about the like a 6210, if that disappears.
So you mean what would happen to it? So this is a theoretical conversation then, and not a, okay.
Let's say we
all right.
adopt 6211,
Mhm.
okay, and it's all encompassing, or gap, there's a gap. So 6210 might disappear. We may not use that anymore. We may make a decision not to use it anymore. But I would still want to make sure that our district followed a policy at a certain time period. So I wouldn't want it completely gone from board docs.
So based
Makes
on,
sense.
it does, and the question, I guess, how we capture that. So Karen, as we think about
Yeah.
revising, or we've noted when a policy is revised, if it's revised and we keep the actual hard copy
Right.
does that revision,
That's
we're
revised.
assuming that that document is still accessible, it's just not
Well,
necessarily.
it is, and it's not ideal
Right.
to just have a paper copy
Right.
and it's your archive.
Right.
So we need to look at that too. But this isn't precedent setting at all. It has happened through the years where a different policy number has replaced another policy, whether, I mean, it's WASDA may have discontinued it.
Yeah, I guess this is an important policy, so I would want a historical tracking of,
Well, let me look into Word docs and see how we can do
yeah,
that.
okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
So that's 5251.
I have a question.
Oh, sure, sorry.
I'm curious about the procedure because I'm curious about the procedures with this because I'm looking down at the last, so I don't know what bullet point it is. It's the biggest paragraph down there where it talks about gifts and travel. And they should be reviewed with the assistant superintendent and for possible conflicts. I'm wondering, are there procedures that go along with that? Because I've not heard of procedure. I've not heard of that happening. And if so, where can we find the procedures that go with this? Do they exist?
So for 5251, yes, and we can do that. This was proposed as a first reading, so part of that second reading is that you'd like to see the procedures.
The process, yes.
The procedures for, okay.
Thanks.
Is that for, Director Daniels, is that for both of the conflicts of interest or 5251?
I would like to see it actually for both of them.
Okay.
I think in general, it'd be good for us to see, before we adopt a policy, to see the procedures that go along with it. I know we don't approve it, but sometimes the crux of it is in the procedures, like the Seattle
Yeah.
one. So,
Sometimes we don't have the policy before we actually create the procedures.
okay,
So,
yeah, that'd be,
I think some of these, although they're, the procedures can get pretty lengthy, we're far enough along in the policy development that I think we can start to get into the how. So,
okay.
it's part of our
Thank you.
conversation.
so this one is a procedure. So it's been our habit as we, this year, even though the board doesn't approve procedure, to bring that for information and discussion. And so this is one related to a policy that was adopted in September. So policy 2410 was revised and updated. And it speaks to our graduation requirements. And there's a procedural recommendation change that we remove the culminating project as a graduation requirement. There are lots of reasons why that could happen. There are reasons why that's an idea that might be time, meaning that it no longer aligns with state graduation requirements. There are some contractual obligations that go along with having a culminating project. And there are actually some bullets there that have been laid out by our principals about why that is a proposed change. And so I brought it here because I know that it is something that is a district belief system. That's why the district has retained it, even when the state moved on. And so I thought that it bears some conversation. And to help weigh in on that conversation, I have Principal Albrecht to bring principal perspective, but Ms. Martin also has kind of perspective of some of the contractual obligations around that too. So this time and space is just for conversation around that. And so the real procedural change that would be happening would be literally the removal of the language of a requirement of the culminating project. And so what you would see next would be the actual documentation and write-up of that removal for your next information.
Because this
Before
was
you-
in our policy before,
Yes.
right?
So all of that was in our policy. Our policy was very prescriptive around graduation requirements, and as the state has changed every year graduation requirements, it became very difficult to keep track of where your child may have been or where the district was in its graduation track, because it was dependent upon when a child starts their high school career, not necessarily on when the year they believe they're going to finish.
Those who are transferring in as well.
Right, and transfers in, and yes. So that is where we are, and so I'd open up to questions, comments, concerns.
No, I completely appreciate that.
Oh,
Oh, may I ask a question?
Yes.
So when I was looking at the policy still does have the culminating project listed in it. So you're saying we would need to update that as well, correct?
So the policy, so here is, and I apologize, Board Docs is in need of the update of the official adopted policy as of September 24th, I believe. So what the handout that you all have in front of you is actually the current 2410 that was adopted as of September. And it doesn't have any language. So it's not just culminating project that was removed. There's no language about the specificity of any of the requirements. All of that would happen in procedure, because we would, as practice, just good practice to do, inform the board of procedural changes and why they would exist. If the state made a different change in graduation requirement, like say they remove assessments from graduation requirements statewide, that would show up in the procedural change and we'd bring that to the board. And so in the same way that we're bringing this for discussion, that is.
yeah, I mean, we approved, I guess, the last, in September, end of September, we approved the policy without culminating projects on it, or anything on it.
Right. What it says is that there would be procedure around it, and so we're here discussing that notion of graduation requirements, and so.
That's fine.
Oh, okay.
Oh, hang on, Deb, hang on,
yeah.
you're all garbled. Try it again.
I
Or
hope,
very
I
upset
was
about
gonna say,
this.
or maybe she needs to pull over. That's,
When I looked on Board Docs, I saw the old one then, so that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that we were in line, so thank you.
So I have a, oh, Denise, did you have a question?
Oh, no, I think this is long overdue. Sorry, I agree with you.
Okay.
Having worked with students that come in at different times and just the challenges that exist, I think it's a good move.
So, yeah, I have mixed feelings, but I totally understand given our budgetary issues, and I don't know, Mr. Albright, you can kind of tell us the difficulties you're facing.
Well, I think your words were correct, but also obvious that I do have mixed feelings too. Is that if you saw the history of this project back starting, I think in 2007, Kentridge was probably considered the leader in that. It's that because it really was a vision of having this and having it be a worthwhile thing. So you and I are on the same page. It's like come with mixed feelings too. But it is time, I think, to move on, and for a lot of different reasons. I mean, you can see the reasons that are listed below, as many of the items that were done in the culminating project can be done in CPE courses, can be done in English courses, research paper, resumes, etc. I think, too, with the reduction of assistant principals becoming even more difficult, the increased number of Running Start kids. In fact, we were just having a discussion today at our students' assistance team meeting, and counselors were saying they're starting to see a trend of kids not seeking Kent School District diplomas in Running Start to avoid doing the culminating project. And they're going right to AAs. And we all know that is that we want to be able to have our kids have an AA, sure, but still have a Kent School District diploma. Our kids are becoming very aware of this and becoming almost consumers of which direction we want to do to get their final destination education. It's not a huge number, but it is kind of interesting. Running Start is so difficult to be able to gather those kids and keep those kids complete Running Start. It would be our number one task, it seems like, to gather them. And graduation was on June 14th. I think last year we did 10 Running Start kids doing their senior oral presentation on June 13th. It's getting them to understand the importance of it. The other thing with Running Start too is that because many of them are taking their English class at community college, is that they're not getting the research paper that is connected with the culminating project, that instruction that we're able to provide, nor the amount of opportunity to review that paper to meet the standard. So that becomes another challenge as well. And then just the simple logistics of trying to get 500 seniors to do senior oral presentations, with the idea that when you do a culminating project and you do senior oral presentations, the idea is the oral presentation is supposed to reflect all of the work of the culminating project. And so making sure every kid has completed every task, has done every part of it, so that they can do a thoughtful presentation that's becoming even more time consuming with one less assistant president.
So if we were to change this, when would that take effect?
There's several different partners that we have to work with. There is language in the KEA contract on the culminating project to include 12th grade teachers, I believe, have a portion of their PEE hours, that are the professional physical effective ed hours. Also, it's written within section or Article 7, and it speaks to it being a requirement of KSD, and so if it were no longer a requirement, obviously we would need to talk with the union about addressing this language. I did have the opportunity to talk with Christy yesterday over the phone and told her about this conversation, and there is no official stance from KEA whether to support or not support a culminating project. They recognize the teachers have varying opinions on it, and so she said if you could share that we don't have an official stance on this, but we would need to work with them because it does impact their contract. So we could not just make a unilateral change without having that conversation.
And so the hope of this, if I could speak for principals, would be that it would be effective for the class of 2019, would be the request. I must, yes.
Yeah, there's a sense of urgency on our part
Right.
to have this discussion, knowing that we have to talk with our other partners. But it's an easier communication to say we're going to take something away than to add to. But at the same point, the quicker we can do that, I think it becomes easier as well, because then you don't really necessarily want an office full of students saying, well, how come you didn't tell me sooner, Mr. Albrecht? I wouldn't have made this arrangement and that arrangement.
So it would come to the board meeting next week?
It could, yeah.
That's the first decision point.
Because we only have another meeting in December.
Right, so we need to have our conversations very quickly.
For sake of conversation, and Mr. Albrecht, I would love for you to weigh in, and I know I've talked with other of our principal colleagues. So we've looked at this from the board district-wide perspective. We've looked at this meaning the culminating project from a local school, teacher, KEA conversation. I know that the last maybe 2 years, we heard from time to time students who would come to our board meetings and express their various opinions regarding culminating project. I have not heard many students as of late. I'd be curious to know what, if any, are you hearing or have we heard from students in particular weighing in on benefits, concerns in general? What are they feeling about culminating project?
Well, since the beginning of this year, I have not heard anything.
Right.
Generally, Dr. Watts, I think what you hear is kind of a mixed report back.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that they all do a very good job in the senior oral presentation, putting a good face forward. Right?
Sure.
And I think that we all enjoy the piece of hearing their job shadow, for example, and how meaningful that was, or how many times have we hear that they've done a resume. Thank goodness they did a resume because they would have never done it before. But being that we could do this in our English classes down going, also is that we're not saying that we can't do a high school and beyond plan as well. I think that we need to keep
Some of
that
it's
in mind,
existing,
because
yes.
that is a state requirement.
Yes.
And so we will be doing that. And if the thought is that OSPI has a model in in which kids can put a resume in,
Into.
they're part of their high school beyond plan. They can put in their community service plan. It's just not necessarily a strict requirement of 16 hours in those cases. But I think we can work with our teachers, and I know our teachers are doing research papers and they're doing resumes, et cetera. And so I think from that part, I think I'm not sure there'll be a whole lot of kids upset that it's not going to be a culminating project. But at the same point, I think there's some value in knowing that there's going to have to. And I encourage you to go to the OSPI site, and here's a model of what they suggest it is. And as you can see, it's pretty comprehensive of what can be done. So we can look at something.
Thank you.
And the high school and beyond plan is absolutely a state requirement, so that is not something that's going away, nor proposed on our end that we not do our, and in fact, our policy flat out says state requirements for graduation, and that is one of them. And some of these things could be embedded into a high school and beyond plan, and probably are good things for a student planning for life beyond high school to have.
The high school beyond plan actually starts at 7th grade.
Right.
Yes, yes.
So,
Which is
From a
good,
state
yeah.
perspective, it should start there, and it should, because kids will be in, in 8th grade, we're already looking at what courses they're going to
Yes,
take.
Code
personal
24.
pathway, all those.
Yes, for sure. And yeah, I've also heard about Running Start being the big issue, and because of the counselors, not having enough counselors. And so we are looking at exemption for the coming year for the students, yes.
We will be presenting
Okay.
yes.
2019.
to
Okay.
our
All right. Any other questions? Debbie or Denise?
No.
Okay.
So unfortunately, we always have more to do, and I feel like we're so close because we have 2 others, but I want to respect the time of my colleagues and your agenda, as you do have something that starts at 6:30, and I think we're pretty...
4 minutes.
We have 4 minutes. Okay, so, yay! Quickly, policy 3115, homeless students, enrollment rights and services. In our most recent versioning of this, you asked for some information about, we rounded out some things about healthcare, language about the district's responsibility to facilitate on-time grade level progression. It captured the most recent updates of WASDA as of May 2018. And I believe Randy Heath is here to speak to any additional questions you might have to the specificities of this. But
I
wanna
think
make
the
sure
only
that-
thing I asked was about the staff being able to have students who are homeless. I think that came up
One of our high
before, yeah, from one of our high schools, and that other districts are allowing it, but we are not allowing it. So I don't think we had a chance to have that reflected here.
Okay.
But that was just a question I had.
Randy, do you have some
Looks
insights you want to
puzzled.
share? Sure.
So, again,
Yeah,
what
it
is
was, it was about staff members wanting to, we had a staff member at Kentwood who was interested in providing housing for one of our students experiencing homelessness, and they were told that our district policy would be violated, or district protocol.
I don't think that had to do with the homeless piece.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it's the student interaction piece that's of concern there.
Yeah.
And the liability and the, not only to the district, but also the potential liability to the employee in the
Right.
situation that puts himself and his family in.
So there were questions about how other districts are doing it. I believe Highline does that, and so I don't think looks like we haven't looked at it.
Okay.
Might be something to come back.
And I don't think that's in WASDA's policy. yet.
No.
I think that was a
Right.
conversation we did have, and I remember just briefly, while we often say everything that is legal isn't always right, and everything that's right isn't always legal. There are situations where organizations, individuals take on a risk, and that was one of the conversations that we spoke to, that in good intention, bringing a student or an individual who may be in a homeless situation into home makes sense out of care. At the same time, not taking into consideration what risk could be. That's why some school districts, in this case, it was a decision that Kent School District made, but not to leave the student without any sort of support, was to make sure that we were addressing the family or the individual's needs through partnerships that we currently have with existing community-based organizations and support systems that are within our boundaries.
But, so I think though, because I know so in our district we do, I think it's different when you have a parent that agrees and allows a student to stay with a particular staff member, understanding that the parent is given permission. So I think that there's different ways that it is addressed.
I appreciate that, Director Daniels, and I'm not certain that was the specific parameters of the situation that we're talking about, but I do appreciate what you just said and understand.
Yeah, I think it's just looking at more flexibility in our situation, when we do come across something like that.
Absolutely.
So I'd want to make sure that we fully connected with our risk management team, including our insurance carrier, including our legal counsel, to ensure that we have fully considered all the liabilities.
And I would appreciate if somebody looked into what other districts are doing.
I actually made 2 notes. I've made a note to investigate neighboring districts' policy and
Okay.
specifically cited Highline and then said check with and listed all of our legal contacts and then put risk management at the end. So thank you.
Anybody else questions? Debbie or Denise?
I guess the only thing I'm thinking is there should be probably a way that even if the policy, it wasn't specifically in policy, but there was something that said some legal way that you could say, yes, we're doing this, but the district itself doesn't end up to be liable.
Yeah, and there's actually a program that is being promoted right now. Actually, somebody put it on the discussion board about the opportunity to house students who are facing homelessness. So they actually have a program that I know some people are interested in, and so it might be something just to think about, as we move forward if it's something that comes up. Because I know they're looking for housing now for some of those students.
Was there a specific name, Director Daniels?
Yeah, hold on one second. I'll
Sure.
tell you exactly what it is.
Okay.
One moment.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Or if you want to send that to us for sake of time, that would
Go
be
ahead
fine.
and keep talking. Oh,
Absolutely.
it's called Host Home. And it's through
Did
the
you say that
YMCA.
one more time?
Host.
Host?
It's called Host Home, and it's through the YMCA.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
And we're working in
Interesting through
partnership with communities and schools through a grant to get Pat, that's last name, and then there's,
Mike Fredo.
yeah, Fredo, yeah,
Okay,
yeah. He's working on that, and they work with homeless families looking for sustainable housing and unaccompanied youth also looking for housing and support for them. So
Yeah.
I mean, that's another thing that we've got
Absolutely.
that's working.
I think as there are established programs with clear guidelines, I think that's easier for us to take a look at that as far as something that we can engage in as a district. What we would not want is side deals of, hey, you can come live at my house, and no one knows it's happening. They've told us the parent knows, we don't know. So it's those types of things. If we are in a program, there's clear guidelines, and I think that certainly is something we could talk about with risk management.
Thank you.
All right.
Great.
So close, but yet so far, and to be
Quickly,
okay. So
Curtis is here.
oh no. Oh, okay. 3122. Last one, yay. Unexcused and excused absence. 3122. Clarifies that all stages of guardianship and informing guardians of unexcused and excused absences and all of that includes language about school staff's responsibility to maintain records about absence statements. Obviously updated the RCWs and WECs, and it captures, WASD has been updating this most recently as of August 2018, so it captures all of that. So, which is interesting. because there have been some updates that are related to our ESSA requirements that speak to excused and unexcused absences as well, so.
Anybody with questions? I'm good with that too. Okay. Debbie, good?
Good, Debbie?
Yes.
I have,
Go ahead, Denise.
well, I was thinking about, so this is probably a question for Randy. So I know we talk about homeless status, but what about students who are in foster care? Or is that something that you're supposed to, I'm sorry, I'm looking at it right now and I don't necessarily see that. Or waiting foster care, because we've got some kids who are kind of in a crossover, they're in temporary foster homes and parents they're not able to transport.
Right, and that is an excused, that's an
That is
excused absence.
but it's just not in here.
I believe that's in the procedures. but
Okay, okay,
I'm
all right.
not positive, but it's definitely the practice of what we're doing.
We could, if that is a suggestion or concern, under the excused absence, valid excuses, we could add that as a number 11.
Yeah.
And
Because
we
we
can
are
work to do
listing
that
it
as
in the
okay.
policy,
Yeah.
so
Okay.
we should.
Oh, I see it down here. Okay, I see it. It is now. Foster parents and the person. I see it. It is in there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good,
you.
Randy?
We'll double check that.
Yes,
Make
please.
sure it's included.
Any other questions?
All right, thank you very much.
So we're done. Well, obviously, there's been some, a few policies that will make it forward. 3122, 3115 will be presented with small changes, but hopefully for discussion and adoption. You'll see the procedural change 2410. And we will, given the length of the discussion around our 6200 series, I'm not sure we want to add that to a board meeting. We will see, but obviously we will continue to work through those, and these will also be policies that will be next on the list. And as we will add our 6200, we'll keep our 6200 series there until we're ready for adoption. But we'll continue to work through that.
We just need to finalize by
Yes.
end of December.
So,
Be 14, December 12th. Yes.
thank you so much, and
Thank you. Thank you for all your
Thank
work.
you, Jewel, and thank you to Sean as well, who's still providing additional support, but not as often. Thank you for your work.
yes, she's still with us once a week
Yes,
on Thursdays.
on Thursdays.
So,
That's
yes.
very good, very good.
And thank you.
So, Curtis?
I'm going to take you off speaker, Deb.
Yeah, I'm gonna drop for just a second. I'll be right in the building. I just pulled in.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right, we are moving forward to our Open Public Meetings Act review with Curtis Leonard presiding.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
I didn't even.
Thank you, Mr. Albright.
Thank you.
Thank you. Curtis, hello.
Good evening, everyone.
to you.
Really an hour on Open Public Meetings Act. I'm sure you guys are excited.
I wouldn't be.
This is a fun topic.
Absolutely. Why wouldn't, yeah.
Taking up a lot of conversation.
Yes, yes.
Getting better.
So Director Strauss.
Yeah.
Would you like to sit here, Curtis? or-
No, this works. I'm fine here. I'm going to be looking at my own screen too.
Okay.
Yeah, you want to push it closer?
Denise, you're okay?
Curtis,
Yeah,
water.
yeah.
You-
You may want to move the phone to over there.
Did you?
We're moving you down to Curtis. Denise.
Hi, Denise.
How's it going?
I'm good. And so who's on this mic? Is someone connected here?
We're live streaming and recording. That's
Live streaming, okay, all right. So are you ready to get started?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks for having me. It's a great opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit about Open Public Meetings Act, an area that certainly is extremely important and governs a lot of what we do. If I had to summarize everything we're talking about today, it could probably be summarized in this slide right here. This is straight from the law. And I have to apologize. You'll have to look at my slides. They're pretty bare bones. I just put the law in. There's not graphics or anything, or color. Thank you, Mariah. We went black and white. All right.
It's okay.
So no frills
Just the
here.
facts, just
So
the
just the facts, exactly. If I had to summarize what we're looking at here, all meetings of the governing body of a public agency shall be public, and all persons shall be permitted to attend any meetings of the governing body of a public agency, except as otherwise provided in this chapter. We're going to go through some of those exceptions here, but that summarizes everything. And I'll tell you, the way the law is written, there is a presumption that where we can do things in public, we will. And so the exceptions to, for executive sessions, we always interpret them very narrowly, okay? And so that means whenever there's a close call in baseball, it goes to the runner. In public meetings, it goes to the public. And so whenever there's an opportunity for us to do things in public, we do, which I think is an important reminder to us. So, of course, Director Strauss, how are you? We're just talking about the Opm A. We've got a whole hour budgeted, but we'll see. I don't know. Take the whole hour. And obviously, at any time, if there's questions or discussion, I know this is kind of just the law, but certainly I'm hopeful that it'll produce questions that you've seen or questions that you might have in the course of the work that you've done. Okay, of course, we know that the Opm A, the Open Public Meetings Act, applies to agency boards, local agency boards, and it includes school boards. Like we said before, all meetings must happen in public. And I found it interesting, the courts and the legislature, they are not subject to the Opm A. So there you go. They write the rules, and it doesn't apply to them. Okay. This is the first exception we get to, and as I go through these exceptions, you'll probably recognize that there are areas that we routinely use. And one of the very first clarifications that we have is an executive session versus an exempt session. Okay? And as you look at this slide here, there's some activities that we do that aren't even governed by the Opm A, and we call these exempt. They're exempt from the Opm A. That means they don't fall in the category of executive session. They're actually exempt. The big one that you will likely see is quasi-judicial actions. That means when you are acting as the judge. So if the board is going to render a decision, it's quasi-judicial, and that happens in an exempt or closed session. So examples of that, as you know, might be sometimes a student disciplinary if it comes to the board, or we've done a couple where there's a hearing where there's an appeal and you're rendering a decision on an employee. That's a quasi-judicial. And generally those are going to be closed sessions. And the other big one that we see a lot, of course, when we get together and we talk about collective bargaining, also exempt. Okay. And so what does it mean to say it's not subjected to the Opm A? It means technically we don't have to announce it. We don't have to do the 24-hour notification. All of that doesn't apply. Okay. In fact, I had a district a while ago that was inappropriately labeling their collective bargaining meetings as executive sessions, and they got an audit hit on it because they thought in an abundance of caution we're meeting in executive session to talk about collective bargaining, and they noted it as such, and the auditor came back and said, well, actually that's not the appropriate way to do it. Okay. So that's one category, and so we just need to be very clear about what's an exempt closed meeting and what's an executive session. And working with this board many, many years, I think we're clear on this. We know when we're in executive session, we know when we're in exempt session. So it's just a good reminder there. A lot of what we're going to talk about is what is a meeting. And we've had questions about email, social media, Twitter, text messages, anything you can imagine. It comes back to what's a meeting. And I find it interesting. Today we're in a work session. It doesn't matter what you call it. Okay, it's still going to potentially be a meeting. Okay, so meeting is where the agency comes together and does agency business. Doesn't matter if you call it a training or a work session or a retreat or a workshop, all those fancy words, it's all going to be a meeting. Okay? A meeting is considered a meeting if you're there to take action. And we're going to define a little bit and broaden our scope of what it means to take action here in a second. And if we drive any point home tonight, I really want to focus a lot on the second point, okay, which is physical presence of the members is not required for a meeting to happen. Okay, and we know that, but I think it's easier said than done. And it goes back to that first slide about what the purpose of the OPM A is the public has the right to see the business happening. And if it's happening on text messages, and if it's happening on email, what do we just do? We denied the right to the public to be present while agency business is being conducted. Okay. A meeting might occur inadvertently via phone or email. The OPM A actually has a provision that if you do a conference call, like if all board members were joining each other in conference call, and this is probably nothing we've ever done, you have to allow there to be a speaker system set up where the public can actually hear. And so it even devises systems, and that's probably a system we've never used, but I mean, think about how that would work with email. You couldn't even devise, I don't know how you could devise a technology that would allow the public to have that same listening in that would happen if you had a conference call and everyone could listen in. So it's very interesting. The next piece is a meeting does not occur if there's no quorum. So quorum, obviously, in our board, if there are 3 or more, okay? And so generally, if there's conversations one board member to another, you don't have a quorum, potentially not a meeting, okay? We all clear on that? I'm going to get more into emails and kind of email protocol here in a second. And Denise, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Am I putting you to sleep, or are you okay?
Oh, I'm hanging.
You're hanging, okay. All right. All right, so this is probably an area that it might be an area of growth for us. Action and final action. So when the OPM A talks about action, I think in many cases we think of final action. We think of the board adopting a resolution, and it's a 5-0 vote, hopefully, right? We think of, and that's final action. But I want to talk a little bit about action. And again, this is in the context of the previous slide where it says a meeting, it's considered a meeting if the board takes action. So you could say, well, that's just when we take a resolution. So over email, we didn't vote on anything, so it wasn't action. Let's expand a little bit our understanding of action. We'll talk about final action here in a second. Action can also include a list of these things as well, okay? And this is probably an area that we want to just put a really fine point on, because if we're conducting emails back and forth, if it's receipt of public testimony, certainly that's going to happen in open session, but deliberations, discussions, that potentially is taking action if you're discussing an item that's germane to the agency business. Considerations, reviews, evaluations, and then of course final actions. So as you look at that, does that broaden your scope a little bit as we look at, a meeting is considered a meeting if action is taken? I think it certainly does, right?
Can we ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So let's say a constituent talked to us about something, and then I sent that information to the board just so they're aware of what that discussion was about. That's a discussion, that's an action, but as a board, we're not doing anything. We're not making, we took action, but we're not making decisions.
Couple of points there that we're going to talk about as I get further along, but I'll address right now. Just receiving information is not discussion. So if you receive an email and everyone in the board receives an email, passive receipt is not considered, that's not on the list of, I received information, okay? Where it becomes problematic is reply all, providing input, discussion that would normally happen at the dais but happening over email. That is where it's problematic. Now, our protocols are designed to help protect us, right? Because the protocols say we want, when we do email, we want to make sure our protocols protect us from getting to the point of where we might be and dangerous waters. And so a good conversation for the board would potentially be, as we look at our protocols, beyond what the OPM A says, what are our protocols if a member of the public sends an email to the board vice president, or it's sent to all the board? Who's going to respond? Certainly there's protocols I've had in other districts where the board president is the voice of the board, and the communication goes through the board president. But those are protocols that are not governed by the OPM A. The OPM A doesn't say anything about that, but your protocols will. And so as you talk about, you know, who's responding, what happens if it's sent to your personal email account, or if it's only sent to 2 board members, how do you share it to all 5 board members? Those will all be areas that we want to talk about in our protocols. Okay. Generally, am I correct in that we've generally had the board president be the point person in regards to providing communications?
Right, part of the problem now is that we're all getting emails, but they're each addressed to us individually. We're all getting the same one, and what's been past practice is that you send that to the president and say, did you receive this, and would you, if you didn't, here it is, and would you respond? Rather than having us respond to the email, or you can respond to the person saying, I've forwarded your email to the president, and that person will be the spokesperson.
Generally that works if you're getting a few emails, but I would imagine as the amount of emails we're getting now increases, it puts a lot of burden upon the president. Let's check in, is that system working? Is that something that has been followed? Is that something we need to brush up on in terms of protocol?
I remember having a discussion about it because my question was why, I mean, I think there are certain things that any of us could answer or respond to. In particular, if there are things, because, you know, if an email's addressed directly to me, I feel I'm obligated to respond to it, and I want to respond to it. So I think if we discussed kind of different scenarios of information, talked about quite a while ago.
Bless you.
And because it is a lot on one person, and again, you know, we talk about, well, although we have our offices, you know, one person shouldn't be the only person responding because we all represent different areas, different districts, and so I think for me personally, I do respond to emails that are sent directly to me or on forward or whatever that looks like, but if it's something that is like maybe something larger, like when we've had people, you know, as far as the complaints and those types of things, and those I think are the response. That's kind of the way that I've done it, and I think we've been doing it.
So just my reaction to that, Denise, is certainly I understand. You have a right in your position to respond, particularly when things are asked of you individually by your constituents. Nothing in this removes that. I would say to the extent that there are responses that represent a response by the board beyond your individual capacity, and a lot of times when there are questions that are posed and they want the board's reaction, we don't want 5 different responses.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I think that's kind of that.
And so we're going to have a system in place where you separate out those questions that are individual to you, Director Daniels, versus those questions that are universal to the board that potentially the entire board is getting, where the board is responding collectively. And that really needs to be coming from the president. And so I would just encourage all the directors to be mindful when you're getting emails to follow that original protocol, which would be to forward it to the president, ask if she's received a copy, and then allow her to respond in her official capacity as president.
And I think when we had the discussion around protocols, that was one of the things we talked about. If it was something that the board was taking action on, or that it was something that, you know, was a larger thing that was going on, that it would be appropriate for the president to give the response for the whole board. But if it was somebody emailing you saying, hey, who do I contact because I need help at my school, that necessarily didn't need to come from the president, but that was more of just a direction of to where things were.
Now there are things that we can imagine individual board members might get input on that I could give you examples where I would want there to be collective action on. Your role is to evaluate the superintendent. I wouldn't want 5 individual voices in regards to that, in regards to your job evaluating the superintendent. That's one that I would expect there to be a collective voice. So I would expect that to come from the president. And so that's an example. Because you evaluate the superintendent as a collective, there's action that's taken as a collective. So that's just an example of one that potentially could come up. And we could probably think of many other examples.
So there is an issue also. Some constituents don't want their email shared with others. So if I were to get an email directly, this has happened a few times where, you know, I would copy the board and then there's a comment, you know, I didn't want everybody to have my email address. So then what do you do with that? Or they don't want it shared with others, but.
Just my initial reaction to that, if someone says to you, I don't want this shared, please don't share with this, I would ask, do they want us?
Well, they don't state that, but I mean, they think they're only writing to me, but I'm then sending it to others. So there's a concern that, you know, their email is going, I think we've had a few of these situations as a district where they said, why is my email being sent to, I think Karen knows, you know, I didn't give you permission to.
Right. From a legal perspective, once you, I mean, this is going to sound somewhat harsh, once you release it into the ether, no one has a right to then expect that their email not be disseminated. If it's shared with the institution, there's no legal reason why this can't be disseminated to any of the board members. I can imagine very sensitive situations if someone felt like, if they said, and they told you something in confidence, and they said, I'm not comfortable coming forward, or those circumstances, those are individual basic, you know, type situations. And in that situation, I would probably clarify with the individual what I intend to do, and then see if they are comfortable with me seeking action on that. And even if they say they're not comfortable, there might be circumstances where we still have to share the information. Because we as the institution can't guarantee confidentiality or that we can't share it, because our obligations, especially whistleblower or other pieces, potentially could be that we do have to share it. So I'd be very careful ever telling a constituent or a member of the public, we're not going to share this information with anyone, because you could be compelled by subpoena. Those are public documents, and we can't guarantee confidentiality. There's no board member constituent confidentiality provision. It just doesn't exist.
And what about when it comes to our personal email?
Okay, so we can take a little bit of a detour here as we talk about, no, it's great. I love the questions, because then it's not just me talking for an hour. Public records, if you do agency business, it doesn't matter if it's public or private email, okay? And so even your text messages, that's not my phone, but even your text messages, if you send something on your own personal account and it's your text message and it's on your own Verizon plan and it's not a district plan, but it's conducting district business, meaning what are we doing at the board meeting? Despite it being potentially an OPM A issue, it's also PRA issue, meaning what's your system for retaining that, okay? We have everything in place to retain our emails. I would ask you, do you have a system in place to retain your personal emails? A little bit of a horror story, I had a board member in another district, which I won't name, the board president only conducted business on their personal email, refused to use the district email. And it got to the point where there was a public records request for her personal emails conducting agency business, and guess what? They were all gone. And I could take you through the statutory penalties and the attorney's fees that accrue because of that action. And I'll tell you that courts don't care if those judgments make you bankrupt. Okay, so long story short, we shouldn't be conducting any agency business on personal email. In the event that someone sends you an email to your personal email, I would likely advise them and forward that to your district email.
Oh, forward it?
I would likely forward and get it out of the loop of your personal email. As long as, if it was a passive receipt and you didn't, if your response was nothing substantive, I don't think you have an obligation to keep that, but I would get a record on that on the district server as quickly as possible by forwarding that to your district email.
Prior to responding, you're saying?
Prior to responding. That way it's in the loop, and then then the response is carried on the district server, there's retention, we know we're gonna retain it, whereas, and I'm telling you, for the text messages, that is always a concern, just because, you know, I don't know the individual user's retention. And so I don't know if assistant principals are keeping their text messages and retaining them, and that's certainly an area that we need to be addressing, probably not today, but just something to be thinking about. Good question, Maya. So we just talked about PRA and personal emails. We were talking about action. There were some great questions. Some pieces about discussion and about email protocols. You know, messages come in. I'm going to get here in a second, but I want to talk about final action first. Okay, so discussion's the big one. So having discussions about agency business back and forth. What do you think about this, or did you know about this? Those are all pieces that should happen at the dais, unless we have an executive session or something that applies. So even discussions about that. And you know that the challenge is, if there's emails sent out, there's going to be a desire to communicate. If it's everyone's on it, that reply all. It's just such a temptation, right?
Curtis, I
Yeah,
apologize, going back to action, one more question.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we want to just check on calendar availability. I sometimes feel like we carry this OPM A to an extreme where we can't discuss, you know, just general things like, okay, are you available on this and date? Is that also an issue when we are checking to see if somebody's available for a board meeting?
Yeah. So generally, I'm imagining that Karen is helping facilitate that as well in terms of availability.
I try to take it away from her sometimes because I think we overwhelm her.
And I appreciate that. I understand. I don't want you to have to schedule everything, but I would say that even the passive scheduling of meetings, while technically not conducting business in the general sense, you're not making some decision, some great decision, I would say that there is a potential that those conversations could be in conjunction with other pieces, right? Like, oh, we're going to be talking about this. And I've seen a lot of times those discussions, the fine line of here we're just scheduling dates, to then become conducting agency business.
But if you're doing one-on-one?
One-on-one is fine. Again, that goes back to, it's not a meeting if it's not a quorum.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so I wouldn't want a message sent to everybody saying, hey, what's your schedule like? And then that's how so if we're doing it that way, I'd want to modify that.
Okay.
Okay? Either relying upon district staff to help facilitate that, or doing it in non-quorum discussions.
Okay.
So if Karen's sending out like a doodle thing where we're all sort of applying to that, we're fine on that, right? Because you have the doodle, right? So you send it out and you say, okay, here are 5 dates, check off the dates that are available. So we're all on it individually. Can't change anybody else's.
We can see what other person
But we
is
can't
saying.
see what other people have put as a time. Is that a problem?
I'm gonna, of course, the OPMA does not mention doodle by name. The technologies have not caught up yet. So I don't want to punt on that issue, but I might need to reflect on that a little bit. Because in reality, even the scheduling of meetings, I mean, you know, as we're scheduling meetings, the agency could do that in an open session very easily. Now, I get that as we're doing special meetings and other things, like you could have the discussion at the dais, hey, when can we meet?
Well, if it's an
Feels like
emergency meeting.
Emergency meeting, we'll get to that in a second, but I would prefer, to the extent possible, even though it's probably more of a burden, that all that discussion could happen either in non-quorum conversations or in open session, even the scheduling of meetings. Okay? So let me think a little bit about doodle. I'll get back to you in terms of, as I formulate what that potentially looks
Great
like.
name.
I know.
Potential death of doodle.
The death of doodle.
So we talked about action. We've broadened our scope a little bit about what official action looks like, but then we have final action. That's probably what we think about a lot of times. Now I'm going to give you some examples of where there can be some close calls when it comes to final action. Final action is the actual vote. It's a positive or negative decision, so even a failure to vote on something, but typically it's a collective positive decision. when it's upon a motion or a proposal, a resolution or order. So that makes sense to us. It's when the board is taking collective action. Secret ballots are not allowed. And so, you know, the example I give on the very bottom there is you might be in executive session and you're appropriately in executive session, but you need to take action at the end in public session. And you know those examples. It might be approving the superintendent's contract, or it might be the sale of purchase of land, other things. And there are times where we're in executive session land, and we take a vote in the executive session, or we take ballots here. You know, everyone put in your paper to see what the vote's going to be, so we can kind of take a poll of where everyone's at. Right there, you're likely taking final action, even though you're trying to get an idea of where the votes are. And so we want a clear delineation between executive session, having the discussion, and then also the final action. And even if that means, it might be clear in your discussion in executive session of the way you're leaning, but any formal votes, roll calls, call to order, how are we voting, that needs to be done in open session. And so there shouldn't be any sort of call to action or paper ballots or anything like that. Generally, the discussion in executive session will lead to what you need to know, and you can ask all the questions you want. Those conversations are protected, but the actual vote, the final action has to happen in open session.
What about evaluation, Dr. Watts? The individual comments, collecting that, does that have to happen?
So you're not eventually going to do, so those discussions could all be under that broad category of an executive session, okay? Comments, what the evaluation looks like, the final action that you take, the actual vote on extending the superintendent's contract, those pieces, that piece has to be done in open session.
No, understood, but I guess I meant collecting everybody's input for discussion during the executive session.
Part and parcel. Yeah, part and parcel of that, and I'll bring up the...
Collection can't happen outside, you're saying. It has to happen in the executive session.
Correct. So, well, the discussion, so if you look at, I skipped ahead here a few slides, the fourth bullet there, to evaluate the qualifications of an applicant for public employment or to review the performance of a public employee. The latter part of that is to review the performance of a public employee. That's pretty broad-based. And so all the discussions related to that, even though some of that data collection is probably going to happen in the normal course, the discussion amongst the entity can happen in executive session.
Right, I understand. I just meant getting that data from individual board members and collecting that is not a meeting or a discussion.
It likely could be. So if you're having one-to-one conversations, that's not a quorum.
Right.
But if the board is collecting data.
One-on-one, and somebody's collecting that information.
To the extent possible, I would like those discussions to happen in executive session.
Okay.
To the extent possible.
Okay.
Because that's the purpose of it, is to sit and have those conversations.
Okay.
But I think, if I understood your question, if we had all done, you know, the individual and the comments and sending them to one person to then put in one document for a discussion, so there's no conversation, it's literally giving them to whoever the comments ahead of time, is that?
You're saying that's still...
Yeah, so
information is being...
It's being discussed.
Yeah.
Even though it's protected under executive session, you really want to be bringing that to an executive session.
But it is being discussed by two, not quorum. Well, I mean, I'm the only other person seeing it.
Yeah.
So it's not being, the information given to me is not being seen by two.
That's a good clarification.
Right.
If that's the way the communication is happening, that's less than a quorum,
Yeah.
and that's compliant with the Opm A.
Okay.
Where would be problematic is an email from Maya to the entire board asking for inputs going back in that circumstance. I would say if there's a question, bring it to the executive session or bring it to open session.
Okay.
I get that we want to be prepared beforehand, but we have built-in protections where we can do this right if we do it in person, if we do it either in executive session or in an open session. And that's another PRA piece too, I think a lot of times we've gotten into the circumstance where we're sending emails all the time, things that we used to just say on the phone. Phone calls are still okay. I know my kids, they don't even know how to dial the phone. They don't know what the operator is. That doesn't exist anymore. But it's okay. I think a lot of times we probably send things via email that in the past we would likely just pick up on a phone and do. And so just a overall thing that we could always remember, not everything has to be an email. We don't have to create public records if we don't need to. We can do it via phone as well.
This is just for information, but I think about what you're just talking about, Curtis, impacts all of our work. So it's policies or rules that are made in the, say, a 20th century world,
Yeah.
and we're now 19 years into the 21st century. What conversations are being had right now about aligning old rules with new technology?
So I'll tell you that the laws I see still mention facsimiles.
Yeah.
And so they're about at 1994.
I still see
So-
people say, "What's your fax number?" What's, really?
Beepers, I don't
Yeah.
know. So it's catching up,
Sure.
but I would tell you that the laws are so broadly defined
Right.
that a document, it doesn't matter if it's electronically filed or stored,
Right.
that it's broad enough to include every a byte of information as opposed to a document. And so the law has been nimble enough to define everything in that way. Our policies probably need to catch up, and I think of, Facebook, Twitter, and, any other forum that you can think of could potentially be conducting a meeting if you're all on there together, okay? All right, but all great questions, all great questions. This is just some further clarification on emails. We've said a lot of this, but I want you to take a look at it. Just to exercise caution when sending emails. Discussing the agency business via email with a quorum can likely be considered action, and that's why we want to be careful with the reply all. When all the board, if you see everybody on it, I automatically want you to be asking the question of whether or not you should be replying, okay, or whether or not it should be a one-way communication with just the president, okay? That reply all function, I've seen a lot of boards and a lot of employees get in trouble with the reply all. Important point here is the second bullet point, passive receipt of emails is not considered action. That's straight from some cases. So if you just receive emails and you do nothing with it, and you just receive the information, that is not considered action. And even if it was sent to all the board members, it's not considered action. And so don't worry about that. Now, if you responded and replied all, that potentially could be. Okay, and this, as we said, will apply to text messages and any other social media platform that you can imagine. Okay?
Oh, a question there.
Yes.
Okay, so an email was sent to Dr. Watts, and I copied the board. Then Dr. Watts replies to the entire board. There's no issue there, right? Because the board still hasn't responded.
You're getting very, very close. You're getting very, very close. Dr. Watts responding, he's not conducting agency business, but I would say, and it's still the passive receipt, but you're in that chain of communication that if one board member responds, it's a violation.
No, so lately just put BCC, and so nobody's
And then
going to respond. But Dr. Watts can still respond.
He can.
Okay.
He can.
I just
In
wanted
his
to
position
clarify,
as
'cause that's
superintendent,
important. Yeah.
he can respond.
Yeah.
I might have misheard your question at first, but I could imagine circumstances, let's say everybody's on it, Dr. Watts responds, and you all got the response as well.
Yes.
And then a board member also chimes in, yes, I agree with Dr. Watts. Well, there we are.
Yeah, no, so the easiest way is to BCC the board, so we don't reply.
Or
back.
email protocols could just be, if it's forwarded along and it's Dr. Watts' issue, Dr. Watts handles.
But I think if there's a question that we all have, and I'm writing to Dr. Watson saying we need this addressed, he should be able to reply back to all of us. That's the.
But we're saying not replying all, but what we're saying is, and we're still working on, we can't even say perfecting this, but getting closer to a reasonable solution, to have the response that in this case, that I give to constituent where the board can see. So the gap here is, how do you as board see the response that I have provided that impacts our work. And our potential solution is finding a place on StaffLink or some one-way communication where you can go and see, this is Dr. Watt's response to said constituent regarding said topic on said date. Other than that, what we're hearing now is that if we continue to, or if there's a reply to all, even if it is BCC, we're teetering on the line at best.
Okay.
That's what I'm hearing.
So to answer your question, Maya,
I'm not hearing.
is it technically a violation of the Opm A? No. Is there a potential that it gets us closer to the line, and if we're not minding that communication, could it potentially be a violation? Yes. If you can tell me that no board member responds, I think we're okay.
Yeah.
All right?
So I think the BCC works.
Okay. I am probably not as tech savvy, but I even know on a BCC, I think you can respond. So
You can't.
You can't?
Unless you put in that person's, I mean, Kent Board or something there, you can't reply all. Or
I just
reply
want,
to
I don't want
anyone.
to, I don't want to create an invitation
Yeah.
because, listen, I think the reply all, the reason why we say the reply all, it can be an accident, but also sometimes someone is fired up, a board member wants to respond.
Yeah,
And
no,
even
I
if you're
agree
BCC,
completely about that.
It's
yeah.
creating an incentive for, hey, I'm on this communication, I want to be engaged in it. And that's when I say, as soon as a board member wants to be engaged, let's step away from the email and let's go up to the dais and do it in an open public meeting.
Right, and I guess my concern is that if we have a common issue that we need answered by Dr. Watts or team, it shouldn't just go to the person that asked the question. I think all board members would need to know the answer to that question. So absent of Dr. Watts replying to every single board member, I think putting it into BCC or something like that would be a solution.
I also want to leave the option for, if it's something of importance to the agency, you could put it on the agenda and conduct in an open public meeting. I want to get away from this idea that there's all this work that happens in an email, even if it's just through a chain of director to director. Though that business should be conducted as much as possible in public.
No, I understand that, but there are times that I don't feel like there are things that can't wait, that are urgent issues that have come up. But I agree with you, to use it to a minimum and address it in an open meeting. I got it.
That'll be the real preliminary rule, and the exceptions will be limited. And so I don't want the BCC to then become the norm, right? I would want, to the extent possible, that we conduct that in an open public meeting, where feasible. And I know it's hard to kind of think of what those issues might be, and there could be, you could give me a lot of examples where I could say, okay, I understand what you're doing there. But let's think in that way, and I think we'll be in a good position. Okay. All right, I'm going to speed up a little bit on this. This is just a case in the Battleground School District that talks about emails. Let's talk about travel and gathering. And going out together, going out to dinner, or going to a WASDA conference, or going to a board retreat, where you're traveling together, or you're at a social event. Is that considered a meeting? The Opm A talks about this. You can be together, even as a quorum. The three of you can have dinner together. The only caveat is, of course, appearance. You get a back room and no one's there, and they see you go into a back room. There can be an appearance that you're conducting a meeting, even if you haven't violated the Opm A. But simply eating together or having a drink together at a social event is not considered a meeting, because you're not conducting business. But the second that conversation goes to, hey, what are we doing on Avid? Or hey, what are we doing on this? You could see that discussion, if we talked about action as discussions, could very well get you very, very close. And so you want to be very prudent. I've had board members, well-meaning board members, start down that road, and another board member will remind them, we probably shouldn't have this conversation. And I've had board members that have been on both ends of that conversation. And they're anxious to get the work done, but they need the reminder, let's talk about this in an open session. Okay, so I'll empower you all to have that ability to do that. Okay? You could even go to another agency meeting. If you were at the Kent City Council, you could go together as a board as long as you're not conducting work. So same rules apply. Okay, so your conversations, your discussions could be about your day and about other things generally, how are your kids doing, but they should be free from discussions about agency business.
And I think the hardest part about that one is the appearance, right?
Right.
And so I know when we're all at different, like we've been judging a science fair or something, even there we're really cautious to make sure that we're not all standing together and talking, because even if we're just saying, hey, how was your day, it still gives the appearance. So.
And from my perspective, this is an area that you guys have done really well on. And please, by me sharing all this, I think you're doing a lot of this already. You're doing a lot of good things. We are getting close on time, but I want to wrap up a little bit on meetings and executive sessions. Regular meetings, agendas are posted online within 24 hours. Special meetings have certain notice, 24-hour notice requirements that are provided here. I would say when there is a special meeting, probably the one that's most forgotten is prominently displayed at the main entrance of the meeting site. So if we're calling a special meeting, that is just something, if it's publicized, that's something we also need to remember, is prominently displayed at the main entrance and meeting site.
And is that, we're talking about 24 hours in advance or for the evening? I mean, for the...
What have we been doing on that? Has that been, we certainly need, the 24-hour notice requirement includes the first 4 bullet points. The prominently displayed, I believe, is upon the meeting.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
The main entrance and the meeting site, okay.
The notification 24 hours prior to start of the meeting.
So the 24-hour notice is provided to the members of the governing body, to the local newspapers, and the posting on the agency website.
Absolutely.
Yep. And then, yes, I actually believe Dr. Watts is right. Prominently, so that display has to be within 24 hours as well. Oh, yeah. Okay. We do have emergency special meetings. These don't come up all so often, but the key to look at here is where there's an injury or damage to personal property or an imminent threat, and time constraints could lead us to not have to or not able to comply with the 24-hour notice requirement. These are few and far between, but the key factor there is if it could result in injury or damage, and you can imagine circumstances that would require this type of meeting and circumstances.
We had a fire at KM right before school started.
Correct. Notice, 24-hour notice is suspended. Yeah. Exactly. All right, last area we want to cover here, and then we'll wrap it up. Executive sessions. Of course, as we know, and we've given you a little bit of a checklist that can kind of help you out. You go through and you can kind of see, you know, an executive session is only part of a regular special meeting, check. Presiding officer announces an open session, the purpose of the executive session, check. The time in which the executive session will end. Legal counsel is present if required, and then it has all the different areas in which you can consider for an executive session. You can extend the time with the further announcement, but let's say we get done early. Can we go back into open session then?
Not to open, no.
No, we have to wait.
Yeah.
And so if that means we just all look at each other and wait until the executive session is over, that's what we do. And the reason why is because the public will want, and we, honestly, we've never gotten done early, right? We always, once or twice maybe.
And we twiddled our thumbs.
We twiddled our thumbs.
Time.
And so, yeah, and because the public is expecting, if you said you're done at 8:30, you're done at 8:30, and if you're done at 8:20 and you go in session and you close it down, the public's not there, they don't hear. Okay.
And Chris, I think that's an important point that it can extend with further announcement. I think sometimes we're trying to cram everything in. And
Yeah.
You know, the next meeting's starting at 7 o'clock. So it is permissible to come in and say.
Yes, it is. I would say generally when we're under the gun, it's because we have a board meeting right after, or we have something scheduled, and the public is waiting. But let's say I have a lot of boards that do their executive sessions after, and you know that makes for a long Wednesday night, but that allows the extension of time if necessary.
So could a board meeting be delayed due to an extended executive session that happens before the board meeting? Is that, as long as you were to say?
I would not want that to be the practice. Your public meeting is 7. You want to start at 7. because you've got problems on your regular meeting not starting on time.
Can you then, so if you had an executive session before a meeting, right, and you needed more time, when you come back out at, say, that 7 o'clock, and that can you say that the executive session would be then continued after the board meeting, or you have to repost it, right?
I feel much more comfortable reposting.
We've done that before, though.
That might be something we need to modify. I feel more comfortable, because it almost feels like two separate executive sessions.
Yeah, okay.
Cleanest
That's
thing?
good clarification, 'cause
Yeah.
we've done that.
Past it, but not recently. But
I know I'm creating more work.
yeah.
No, but that was a good question.
So if we know
We
we've
know
got
we're gonna
an
know.
executive session that's going to take a long time, could we ahead of time say executive session at 6:30 to 7 and
Yes.
continuing at 8:30 till 9:30?
You
and
could
post it at the same time?
You could do it in one notice.
Okay.
That provides adequate notice, because in reality, if you talk about what is required, purpose and time it will end must be announced before the exclusion, okay? So if you've done that, you could do it in a multi-part. It would need to be done before the exclusion, okay? That you can do. Here are some examples of areas that you might go into executive session. I just want to kind of highlight issues that I've seen, not from your board, but generally. If you look at the first two, they're about real estate, selection of a site or acquisition of real estate by lease, or considering the minimum offering price. Those are very specific directives, specific agenda items. I sometimes see boards that just say, well, we're talking about real estate generally, okay? And you see, it's really about the selection of the site, or it's talking about the minimum offering price. Okay, those are the items in which you're in executive session, because they have a price component to it. Okay? Then I gave you some other examples. Discussions with legal counsel can really be found in 3 bullets, but counsel needs to be present. So if you're invoking that provision and you don't have an attorney there, then really you're not in executive session to discuss potential legal. All right? And something to note, the second bullet point, you can only discuss the matters contained in an announcement for executive session. So let's say you authorized real estate, so you're discussing selection of a site for real estate, but then you also know, well, we also want to talk about pending legal and courtesies here. Let's go ahead and knock that out as well. If it wasn't noticed as that, you can't do it, even though it would be appropriately handled in an executive session. Okay? And attorney can be present. The law says in person or via a two-way communication device, which is typically a telephone. So you can have counsel on the telephone, and that would be appropriate for an executive session. This is just a reminder of confidentiality. Members of the board have a legal duty to keep the information in confidence that you hear at an executive session, and are actually prohibited by the Code of Ethics from really revealing that information. So it's just an ethical responsibility that all board members have that I know you all take very seriously. I think that's it. That's my last slide. One thing I did also want to say is the penalties for violating the Opm A. There are really 2 or 3 components. One is the action you took if in violation of the Opm A is void and null. And so if you took action inappropriately through an inappropriate meeting on the email or in a meeting that was not appropriately convened, that action is invalidated, for one. There also can be civil penalties against board members. It's not something we talk about a lot, but if you knowingly, and the key word there is knowingly, attended an Opm A, a meeting in violation of the Opm A, there can be penalties up to $100 per occurrence per board member. And if it's if you do it again, it can go upwards of $500 civil penalties. So it's certainly something we want to avoid. While not the biggest penalty you can imagine, it's certainly, and the appearance and the mistrust of the public also are certainly penalties that are not monetary, but are, as we erode trust in the public, that's certainly not something we want to do. Okay?
So, question about intent. So the door being not open.
Right. Mistakes happen. Yeah. I would say whenever mistakes are made, the knowingly piece is important. If it were a mistake, there is something in the law that implies intent to a certain extent, and it protects board members that unknowingly violated OPM A. You know, we thought the door was open and it was not. The janitor locked it in the middle. I think you have a very compelling argument to say we didn't knowingly deprive the public, okay?
By communicating that
Openly, a mistake was made, owning up to it early, being as transparent as possible, correcting the messages as soon as possible. Honestly, at times, there's a perception that there's a grand conspiracy. I have found that there's often not, that the truth is less salacious, and we just provide the truth, and that's it. So you have your checklist here, and it's got some great information. It's provided by the auditor, and it's got great information here. It could be something that we just look at, and as we go forward, just be mindful of these. Certainly, if there's ever any questions, you can reach out to Mr. Reynolds or myself, and we can provide guidance in regards to some of these guidelines. And we certainly need to continue to do trainings on this. We're required and mandated by law to provide trainings on OPM A every 3 years, and so that's something we want to make sure we're doing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
So thank you all for coming. We will recess the work session for an executive session for approximately 30 minutes to discuss complaints or charges against an employee and a board member. We're adjourned. Thank you all.
I was worried.
I didn't see the second one.
Questions?
Oh, good.
Thanks for your help. I appreciate it.